Today's event is a timely return to HEY and EYFS reform or revisions 1 year on. That conference that we held on the 6th was our first major online event. It was free to attend and we were really blown away by the response to it. We had 1,600 people registered to attend the conference. We had about 950 people attend on the day. And since we've posted the recording of the conference for you to access at leisure, we've had over 1,100 viewings of that. So absolutely fantastic level of interest. Of course, at HEY, we are here to support a new, modern, informed and positive approach to early years. We think there's a great need for that, and to, of course, offer training, consultancy and policy development support in the process. Because we, like you, are interested and committed to raising quality through curriculum progression and with a pedagogical repertoire so we can optimise the learning that occurs in children's early years. And we can do that if we're able to implement effective observation and assessment through evidence-based, research-driven approaches. But we want to be able to articulate that to everybody who has a stake in early years and childcare in ways in which connect us together as one sector and situates us properly in the continuum of services that children and families access to support them to meet their needs. So I know that we've already sent you information about the briefings that we're offering, the training that we're developing, and the on-site support to support practitioners and settings to put that into practice. And I'm pleased to say that just a few weeks in, that bookings for our briefings and our keynote speeches are already coming in, which is really exciting. So the format for today's hour is that I'm going to ask Jan in a moment to share his reflections around what happened at the conference, some of the themes from our paper that we launched on that day, and the things that occurred to him since, and the reaction really to it, and the reaction to HEY as a new programme. Then we'll open up the discussion. I've got a few questions. I don't know about you, I've got plenty of questions, but that's the time for you to start popping things in the chat and popping your hand up. And before we finish, at about 10 to 2, with some summary thoughts before we close at 2 o'clock. So fantastic. Let's get on with it then, Jan. So what has occurred to you? What are your reflections and thoughts of the journey so far?
Oh, thank you, James, and welcome to you all. It's lovely for you to join us on this this kind of lunchtime sesh. Yeah, the thing is, because James and I had been talking about this for a while and kind of shaping the paper, which had several hundred iterations, and we kept kind of thinking about different themes and different elements of it. So the conference kind of came at the end of that process, which was really interesting. But one of the things that struck me most was the consensus out there for the need for, and I'm trying to express this in the best way possible, so apologies if it doesn't come out quite in the way it should. It's almost about stepping back and taking a breath and looking at things how they are. All of us have been through this incredibly intense, turbulent journey over the past 2 or 3 years. Partly with COVID, the EYFS review, all the kind of machinations around that, and I think there was certainly a feeling that let's step back from it. Again, that's probably not the right phrase, but let's kind of look at this and think, well, actually, kind of where are we? I've been involved in the sector for over 30 years, and I can say without shadow of a doubt, this is the most sophisticated, most articulate, most respected, and the highest profile early years has ever been. Now, admittedly, that comes from a low starting point, and there's a lot of work to do. But we are very much in the public domain. We very much part of public focus. There are continual articles, particularly about the impact of COVID on very young children, issues around school readiness. I mean, pretty much every day there's something which focuses on early years. We have foundations that the Duchess I call her Kate Middleton. Sorry, I'm not up on that. She's probably
Duchess of Cambridge. Yeah.
yes, her. Sorry. And a huge a plethora of kind of foundations. Kindred is another one, which are generating this sort of buzz of interest around early years. And again, I think one of the things that we wanted to articulate very specifically was we talk about the importance of a quality early years experience for children, and we know that has dramatic impact on life chances and so on. But what we need to do, and I think what we want to really drill down and strip the layers off is what is that? How do we define that real quality, and how do we define, articulate, and facilitate that real quality in the context of retention and recruitment, in the context of funding? And it's not denying any of those things are really existential issues, but looking at how we shape that. And James you talked about the idea of being evidence led. You talked the idea about the status of the community and how we communicate that as part of a continuum. It's quite interesting because at the moment, and James did mention the work we're doing. One of the things we are offering, which is proving to be quite popular, is we will be doing a national briefing, which will be termly or sometimes half termly, a digest of what's out there, what is the direction of travel, what is the landscape. And interestingly, I'm doing the kind of background work to that in the moment and kind of pulling things together. And one of the things that's come across is, and it's in the context of the Labour Party's announcement to increase maintained nursery provision. There was a link, I came across it on the BBC, and there was a link to this analysis of provision in Estonia. And Estonia, I predict, Estonia is going to be the new Finland in terms of early years provision. It's incredibly, I mean, probably won't no one listen to this, but it's incredibly well funded, has incredibly high status, high levels of qualification of all the educators and so on. But one of the things they were really keen on saying was this isn't just care, it's education. We are educators. And I think if there was a single thing, I think there were many things, but if it's a single thing, I think we need to be the most articulate and the most forceful about even is the education role we have in young children's lives, and how deliberate and conscious that is, how meticulously thought out it is, and how impactful that is. And I think in the conference I said, I think one of the most pernicious myths in early years is that things just happen. If you do this, it will just happen. Nothing just happens to children. It is all the result of very careful, highly thought through professional decision making that impacts on the lives of children. And I think articulating that and getting that really clearly into the public domain, I think is part of, I think, what we are aspiring to do. But also, to go back to perhaps my first point, refining what that quality is and what that actually looks like. And again, one of the pieces of work I've been doing is about training and some work around effective interactions, and how you sort of turbocharge those moments to make them as impactful as possible. And I think there is a whole range of strategies, a whole range of pedagogical repertoires, and a whole range of assimilating information about children as we interact with them, we work with them, that will optimize that. And I think that is a really interesting way of moving forward. So I mean, those were some of the themes that came across, and another one that again struck me was the need of how we have that debate, and how we engage both with each other, and also how we engage with the wider community in terms of early years. So it's a similar theme in a way. But again, I think there felt like in that meeting, and again, an incredible number. I mean, 900 people turned up to that live, and we've had however many, James said, downloading it. Listening to sometimes quite challenging, contentious points of view, sometimes quite different interpretations of quality. I think they all weave around the same point, which is we want the best things for children, but we need to define what that is. No one says, well, we don't want the best things for children, we want them to be really miserable, we want them to not know anything. No one says any of that, but I think we do differ slightly about how that is approached. And I think that's a good thing, because I think the nature of young children, as the EYFS says, is they are unique, and what they offer us and what they arrive as is unique, and we have to work with that. The other part of that, which I think we also need to be aware of, is that educators are also unique. As an educator, you come to that role with a completely different set of experiences, different sets of understanding, different traditions, different ways of being parented, different experience of school or education. You've read different books, had conversations with different people, gone to different training. Your perception of your role is as individual as the unique learner in early years. And rather than that being something I think we need to iron out, I think that's something we should celebrate, because it's that nature and that notion of professional judgment which is, I think, so critical to that whole idea of quality. There was an interesting exchange on Twitter with Dr. Julian Grenier recently, in which he was talking about the interface between evidence and professional judgment. And I think, again, that's a really important place to start, because we do talk about evidence, we talk about things being evidence-led, and that's really important. But evidence in education is it's not like scientific evidence, not like the repeatable phenomena of gravity. Evidence in education is highly, sometimes highly subjective, it's highly interpretable. And apart from what we know basically about the brain and the way that dendrites and synapses connect, everything else apart from that are theories. They're theories of interpretations of that. We don't know anything definitively about that. So there is a huge amount of professional knowledge and professional judgment that comes into what we do. And I think that's really important. So I think that, again, that certainly came across within the conference, and I think we had all these very, very quite different perspectives coming from different places in terms of articulating that experience of the EYFS and what it's meant and how it's impacted practice, how it's been interpreted, how it's been distilled down to educators, how it's been supported, and so on. So yeah, so I think that's quite that's, I suppose, my initial view of it. But you know, I think my final view is I felt very positive coming out of that. I felt very positive about the state of the sector in terms of its resilience, in terms of its motivation. All of us remain, and I think the context around us define this, we remain 100% committed to doing what we do, because we know it has an impact on children, and because we know that changes the future. You know, often when I talk to educators about why they became educators, it's about having an imprint on a future you don't see. You leave your impact on children that goes way into the future, and you see that when people talk about their first educators and their first teachers and so on. And we remain committed to that. We remain committed to ensuring that whatever we can do, those moment by moment decisions that we take, optimize the opportunities, the potential for those children. And that's a good place to be in, because we have had a lot of knocks, and are continuing and will continue to have lots of knocks in terms of infrastructure, in terms of some of the context around us. But I think that drive to better the lives of the future, to better the lives of what happens next, is a really strong, rich vein of motivation for all of us. So yeah, so those are my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Jan. I mean, I'm scribbling away here, and I'll remind everybody, start putting things in the chat, and if you want to make a point or put a comment or question in, and put your hand up if you want to verbalise that. But it seems my first scribble was that point about you saying that early years has the highest profile ever. I mean, I was struck. I mean, we had a very here's the first understatement of today's session. Haven't we had a very interesting and dynamic political environment over the past few weeks? Actually, since the Hay conference, all sorts of things have changed in that past month. But I was struck that in every announcement that we have had recently about cost of living, and supporting families, that early years and childcare has been stated as one of those solutions to support that to happen. Now, I think we could all have the discussion and the debate about, well, the ideas put forward in the way in which early years and childcare can support those matters haven't been thought through in the way in which we would, as a sector, recommend. But people, even with that background of profile and asks of us as a sector, people say it isn't enough. I mean, that's the most common narrative, isn't it? People say, actually, we're not respected enough. So we are ambitious as a sector to be respected and included more. So everybody wants this to be, to have a greater voice and a respect and an involvement in the whole development of the sector. I suppose what's missing is, well, how do we then achieve that ambition? How do we bring that ambition to those with the power and the influence, rather than waiting for that to arrive by chance, by luck, or by coincidence?
No, that's really important, and I want to just re-emphasize, I'm not saying we're there, but I'm saying it has grown. It's grown exponentially, certainly since when I was a very young teacher, many previous century, and certainly the reputation or the profile of early years is much bigger, and you're right, absolutely right. I think, and again, it's something we touched on in the paper, that I don't think we should be waiting for us to be recognised. I think we need to. One of the things we really need to do is to be proactive, going out there and explaining to people why early years is important, what we know about early brain development, for example, and the kinds of things which theoretically, at least, we know have the greatest impact. And what the research shows, the research about the impact of early years is fairly uncontested, even when people disagree about the context. I think it's one of the things that people agree, that it makes a difference. What happens to you when you are from birth to 7 makes a difference, if it's done really well or if it's done really badly. So at the very least, we have a consensus that it matters. And yes, let's have the debate about what that it matters looks like, and let's pull in everything we know and all the research, all the experiences, all the perspectives on that, and have that debate professionally and sensibly and respectfully. And I think, that in an essence, that that's what I think is our aspiration. It's, hey, I don't want to get all Chairman Mao, but he said, let 1,000 flowers bloom. And I've always thought that's a really good starting point, because it's through that synthesis of different ideas that we reach consensus and we reach new ideas, and we go off in those different directions, which everybody will do. I had a really interesting experience a couple of years ago when I did an audit for a multi-academy trust, and I visited about 12 different schools. And they were schools right across the spectrum, from inner city schools to coastal towns to like rural villages and so on. And each single one was completely different. Some of them were, structured in particular ways, but they all had an essence of quality about them. And some of them worked in the way that I would have worked, and the way I worked as an educator, as a teacher, and some of them worked in a completely different way, which I could never have worked in. But in terms of what they were achieving for children, it was good. The outcomes they were getting, and the kind of the arrival of children at the end of EYFS was really good. So I think we need to be more conscious of that diversity, and more conscious that there are many paths to the top of the mountain, but the view is always the same proverb, which I constantly use. And recognising that we're looking at what this achieves. We're looking at the type of children, the type of knowledges, type of behaviours, type of competencies that they have at the end of this, and acknowledging that, as well as that children are individual, so are approaches, and so are individual educators. And again, that's something that has certainly struck me since the conference, in the conversations I've had with people around it.
That's interesting. I mean, if Mao says 1,000, if you should let 1,000 flowers bloom, then perhaps it would be really appropriate in early years to say 1,001. 1,001 days, 1,001 flowers. So But is there a tension here? Because I mean, you've said you've worked in early years for 30 years. You will remember that at the beginning of that period, there was no or very little research and evidence that enabled us to talk in this sector in those terms. And over that 30 years, as you've said, we've moved from a position of very low evidence and research to one that's much higher. And actually, it's amazing how the sector has matured over those years and how many academics and professors we've got in the subject, and the papers that have evidenced the approaches and the types of approaches that really do make a difference for children. And that is often quoted. It's often quoted, and then what normally follows is a strange policy announcement that's sort of tenuously linked to the research. But of course, you are calling for more evidence-led practice. But then the tension there perhaps is that we're all organic beings, we're not robots, and we all interpret the evidence differently, in the same way that many people interpreted the revised EYFS differently, or were concerned about things not being in the EYFS, or wanting more things to be in the EYFS. So it's that tension about how we interpret evidence versus that professional judgment, I think. And I just wonder what gets in the way of people having confident professional judgment in the sector, and actually and how do we properly use the evidence, I guess, is the question.
No, I think that's a real issue. And I think overall, again, I'm trying to phrase this as diplomatically as possible, but I think we could be more confident, and we should be more confident as a sector. And I think sometimes we, as a sector, we veer towards what we think is the panacea or the holy grail. And you often see that in I'm going to have to be very careful about what comes out of my mouth next, but some of the approaches which become very popular, become part of the culture, but which have no evidence base, no theoretical base. Sometimes they're just ideas someone has had, and then they take on the life of their own, and they become this new orthodoxy. And I think that's been a feature of the sector for a number of years. And I think success will be measured when people are more critical and more judicious about the approaches that they use. So rather than saying we have to do this because that's what everyone's doing, they say we're not going to do this because we're going to achieve outcomes in this different way without using this particular approach or this particular thing or this particular resource. So I think that will be the proxy for the maturity of the sector, when we don't have these particular, I'm going to use the word gimmicks that override what happens. So I think you're right, and I think how we interpret evidence and how we work with evidence, and as I said before, how that interfaces with professional judgment is a really interesting sort of contested space, if you like, because it's like, as I said, it's not like science, it's not like repeatable phenomena, it's not even like medicine. We're dealing with the most complex structure ever known, which is the human brain, both in terms of its original development and in terms of its DNA, but then the experiences that happen up to the point when children start in provision. So we're dealing with this infinitely completely ununderstandable phenomena. So there is going to be variations in that. But again, it's, I think this role of professional development, professional judgment, and self-reflection, and being secure about values, being secure about your pedagogical repertoire, but also being flexible within that to know when that changes and when that doesn't work, rather than having a template, is going to be really important. But yes, I think part of the role of, I think what we want to do is that role of the pracademic, interpreting academia, interpreting research into what it means on the ground floor with a child in the SAM tray or in the book area or in outdoor provision. What does that piece of research about cognitive load, or what is that piece of research about metacognition or self-regulation or co-regulation. What does that mean to you when you're approaching a child to support their learning in a context, or you're delivering a whole group session, or you're reading? What does it mean in practice? How do we imbue that into the fabric of how we approach things? And because that's where it will come out. And there's no simple solution to that. There's no direct channel. It's about, I think, immersing ourselves in what we are learning. And I think the science of brain development is still not even in the Stone Age in terms of its development. What we know is still very, 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 very limited, and certainly how it relates to educational practice, that the links are theoretical and speculative. And I think that's why some people are very wary of evidence-based research, and I understand that, or I don't agree with that. I understand that, and it is about the interpretation of it and having the confidence to be true to what you're doing.
Which I guess is, the tension that Ofsted has always had to grapple with, in that it has an evidence-led framework to inspect provision against, and then a assessor, an inspector, comes along and makes professional judgments against the evidence presented to them in a setting, and the evidence requirements that the Ofsted inspection seeks to enforce, but seeks to assure or accredit, certificate, inspect, register, all of those words. And we've seen that tension, haven't we, in that often we've felt as a sector that those inspections have not always been right, or not always the inspection outcomes that maybe we were expecting or wanted, or felt that various provision deserved. I mean, Fiona, who's an EYFS advisor from Rochdale, makes the point in the chat about the significance that Ofsted has identified the EYFS as a focus in their 5-year strategy, and the importance there of taking the initiative rather than waiting to respond to their findings and recommendations. I mean, what do you think to that?
No, absolutely. I think that's. I mean, you've raised Ofsted as a point of discussion, which is really interesting and really important. First of all, let's welcome a focus on early years, and I know everyone will be thinking, well, it's a double-edged sword potentially, but let's welcome a focus on early years, because again, that raises the profile. I mean, Amanda Spielman made a speech yesterday, I think, where she said she makes no apologies for starting with early years, for all the reasons that I said at the beginning about recognizing the critical nature of its phase. And let's engage with that. Ofsted also developing a curriculum team under Phil Mims to look at innovation and the development of curriculum within early years, which again I think is, again, if I was to pinpoint one thing, it would be the understanding of curriculum, and the understanding of curriculum progression with early years is vital to that notion of impact, and recognizing curriculum isn't just areas of learning. It's not just maths, literacy and language. It's also about learning, as we said in the paper, it's about the critical role of learning behaviours, the engines of learning, which we have to some degree in the characteristics, but I think they need quite a lot of unpacking and expanding to be truly realised. But yes, and engaging with that, and where that curriculum, when it comes back and it doesn't necessarily resound or fit with things, we need to be able to have that discussion, that debate. But I think anything that raises the profile of early years is going to open up those discussions, and that's precisely windows we can jump through to make the case of why early years is like it is, why the nature of child development underpins what happens, why the nature of interaction, and particularly the role of interaction during children's led episodes of activity, is so vitally important. It is one of the things that distinguishes early years from other sectors of the education community. We have those kinds of environments, exploratory environments, but they are there to support, embed, rehearse, and internalise learning. And if you're not an early years specialist, they can look and feel like very different strange alien kind of landscapes where nothing significant is going on. It does take a degree of skill to see beneath the surface of that, to understand the quality of what's happening. But these are the kinds of opportunities, when Ofsted are talking about, those are the kind of opportunities to have those discussions and to make those kind of points, and to really shift the perception of early years, of how it works in practice. So yes, I mean, I absolutely welcome the Ofsted focus, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that develops, and seeing how the curriculum team develops that notion of curriculum. Because remember, the EYFS is not a curriculum; it's a framework. The curriculum is self-constructed, designed and implemented by settings, and it has to be because it has to, one, meet the specific needs of the children you're working with, which there will be infinite variables. It also, as I said before, has to work within the individuality of the educators who are implementing it. So curriculums will always be very individual, often quite idiosyncratic. So having some discussion around that, having discussion around the principles of that, and what the kind of processes for that are, is really really important. And I do think, and I've said this already, I do think there needs to be a shift in that understanding, which is happening, but I think is really important. I was doing some work with teachers recently, last week, and we were looking at curriculum progression from entry to nursery to the early learning goals. How do you get from there to there? What is the curriculum that enables that? And we spent a lot of time delineating curriculum and learning from activity, because to start with, people were coming up with activities, and we were saying, no, that's an activity. We're talking about what is the learning that happens, because the activity is the pedagogical repertoire, which could be infinite. It's actually the focus on understanding the learning that needs to happen and how that's then supported that really defines that notion of curriculum progression. And I think we've come a long way in a short space of time in terms of understanding that, but I think that's still work to be done. So yes, that's yeah.
Okay, and I'm very happy to ask you another question, but I do want to remind everybody that you can ask questions on the chat or by putting your hand up. So, but in the meantime, I will carry on with my thoughts and responses. I wonder, do you agree that actually often when others look at early years, and it's not just schools, but schools is a good example, and when they start to look at early years, do you think there's a strong tendency for people to try and convert early years into provision that looks and feels and operates like their familiar ground, and actually doesn't understand the characteristics of early years, which I think perhaps we ought to protect them? I think early years should have protected characteristics. So do you agree that there's a risk that people's interest tends to be to convert early years into something else rather than bring it into the continuum that I talked about earlier?
No, absolutely, and I think this is exactly why we need to be proactive and assertive in these moments. Otherwise, the decisions get taken for us by people who don't necessarily understand it, and that's not always their fault. They're from a different sector of education. Early years isn't for everybody, and that's I completely understand that, and that's how it should, that's inevitable. But yes, absolutely, we need to influence that debate and that discussion so it doesn't become, a watered down Key Stage 2 model or watered down secondary model. And I don't think people do that with malicious intent. I think it's, as you said, I think it's their familiarity, and they without that kind of specific knowledge, they make a conversion which isn't accurate. Early years is a high, knowing and understanding early child development is a highly specialised, highly knowledge-rich period of education. Early years educators are highly specialised in terms of child development, but also how they work. I don't think, and other teachers in other sectors might disagree, but I don't think any other sector needs to be as responsive and as flexible, and to have such a infinite pedagogical repertoire immediately at your disposal as working with early years is. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that needs to be acknowledged. So when, for instance, when we follow children's interests, I mean, I think that's a term again which has been widely used and misused. But if we follow a fascination that a child has, we're scaffolding and supporting their development as learners. For example, when children are interested in dinosaurs, for example, and they follow that as a theme, as an idea, it's not actually about the dinosaurs that they're learning. They are learning facts about the dinosaur knowledge, but what they're actually learning is those behaviours about being a learner, being a researcher, being able to articulate things, being able to speculate, being able to make hypotheses. Those are fundamentally important learning behaviours, which they are wrapping around dinosaurs or wrapping around something that they're interested in, whether it's volcanoes or aeroplanes or football or whatever the fascination is. And I think there's sometimes a perceived dichotomy, which isn't real, that this kind of conflicts with a knowledge-based curriculum. It's not. It's actually how we set up children to become knowledge seekers, how we set up them with these skills and competencies to be able to attain, acquire, and work with knowledge, which is what we aspire to. So I think some of those typical characteristics, like you said, James, that you see in early years, need to be understood by people, and they need to be unpacked so they can see how critically important they are and critically fundamental to that child's development is. But again, as I said at the beginning, this is a massive opportunity, and I think what we need to be is brave enough to be proactive in having that debate and informing people and both challenging people, but also being challenged and responding to that, to have that conversation, that dialogue.
So, I mean, I couldn't agree more that early years educators are highly specialised, responsive, flexible, and skilled. So, what can we do to better make the workforce feel all of that? Because I think if they were to feel that at greater levels, I think the workforce may be more confident and able to articulate that to those that need to know.
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? How do we get there? Well, first of all, I think it's not an overnight. It's not waving a magic wand. It's not putting on a piece of CPD or a conference. It's not as simple as that. It is about shifting a culture. I do think sustained professional development is a key part of it. And I think we also, this is another issue, which again has been discussed widely on social media, the importance and the nature of CPD is something we need to really put in the spotlight. There's a lot of CPD out there. It's a variable quality, I'm sorry, but it is. Some of it is incredible and is transformative. Some of it is less so. And I think we need to be a lot more judicious about the nature of CPD. Interesting, in the role I've recently had or still have with international schools, we've just set up a CPD portal, a CPD academy. And when I was commissioning training for it, I had 3 criteria. One was CPD had to have a demonstrable, quantifiable impact on children's outcomes. If it doesn't do that, there's no point doing it. You can make very circuitous routes to that, but you have to say, if we do this, it will increase, it will improve children's experience, it will improve their outcomes. Secondly, it has to be able to support educators being able to articulate their craft. So alongside the impact on children, it has to be able to empower practitioners to say, this is why we're doing it. This is why we're doing it, and this is why it has an impact, and this is why it supports outcomes for children. So educators understanding the craft and being able to articulate it, I think will increase confidence. And thirdly, it has to be universal. So this was for an international hub. So all the best CPD ever is not necessarily aligned to a particular approach or particular curriculum. They are necessarily eclectic, because it's through that thousand flowers, it's through that variables and those different perspectives that you find your own professional truth, you find your own personal pedagogy. So we need to be a lot braver in looking at different approaches, different ways of doing things. And even when we're critical of them, we can take things from them. You know, I'll give you a personal example. I'm quite critical of the Steiner Waldorf approach. I think it is quite interesting, but I have deep issues with some of it. But there are elements of it which I really, really appreciate. For example, they talk about the educator being necessarily needing to be someone who is a person worthy of emulation. That's the phrase. And I use that all the time, because that is the nature of teaching. You are constantly on show. And so that there are parallels, even in approaches that we have issues with. I think we need to be able to take from them and be be open enough to do that. So I think CP, I would say, I think it's not as simple as putting on a conference, but I think the element of CPD, good CPD, which both informs and empowers educators, I think is certainly part of that. I think the parallel that runs with that, which is I suppose the other arm of Hay, is the political and policy element of it, and ensuring that the early years is in the right focus, like it is with Ofsted, like it is with as you said, with all of the kind of socioeconomic issues that are coming out. They often relate back to early childhood and early childhood provision. And I think there is work to do. Part of that work to do is a sort of ambassadorial work with politicians and policymakers to ensure that the understanding of early years is secure within that.
Mm. Sian from Greenwich makes the point that the work with parents and carers is important to help them understand that although an early years space doesn't look like they would expect a classroom to look like, it's a space for learning and education. And Julia agrees that we can be the best educators in the world, but parents and carers are children's primary agents of socialisation and learning. They're primary educators. We need to be even better at getting parents on board with supporting dysregulation, understanding development, learning through play, emotional literacy, etc. So it's good, good to recognise the role of parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's something we absolutely need to touch on. And again, informing and supporting and having that dialogue with parents. And again, parents being on the same page as educators in terms of that understanding. So yes, I absolutely, that's got to be a dimension of doing that. And you're right, particularly, I think learning behaviours and those engines of learning, they are shaped in very, very early childhood. So the more informed and confident parents are with understanding that, I think the stronger impact that will have on children. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think I also think that that there's been a parallel process here as well. How I talked about the growth of research and evidence over the past 25 to 30 years. What we've also seen is we've seen a whole generation, through that time we've seen a lot of parents and families engage with early years education like they've never have before. We've had 20 years plus of funded early years entitlements. So actually, a lot of children and a lot of families have benefited from early years provision, and it's built an understanding of all of those families about what early years looks like and its impact. And I think actually that gives us a very large and powerful cohort of people who can support us as a sector to continue to grow and develop. And in contrast, we all saw how the pandemic and lockdown actually highlighted what an environment without early years education might look like for parents. We're all grappling with the impacts on children's learning and development, but crikey, how how much did parents verbalise the fact that they weren't able to access their provision and felt a great sense of loss that that wasn't happening for their children at that time?
No, absolutely. And also I think parents recognise the challenges and the skill of educators to do that. And there were lots of social media tweets about saying, how do you, I've got one 4-year-old and I'm struggling. How do you cope with 30 for a whole day? How, you know, and I think again that's an opportunity to reflect on that. Interesting, and you know, going back to Estonia, and it is you know, I think it is the relationship between parents and educators is very particular, is very unique in England. And I think one of the things they talk about in Estonia is the relationship they have with parents, which is much more fluid and co-respectful. Something that again, and again, I think you know people have raised this very astutely. It lies at the heart of the success for those children. So we have to have that as a dimension to what we do. Absolutely.
Fiona from Rochdale's back on again, and she highlights usefully, I think, the development of whole school curriculums has enabled the opportunity to enlighten colleagues about EYFS and the importance of learning behaviours, interactions and engaging with parents. And I guess this sort of links into that theme of yours around us needing to articulate the education role to all of those that need to understand it. But I guess one of the things that I feel gets in the way is that I don't think we as a sector are happy with the same terminology. I think we're divided by a common language, to use an old phrase.
Yes, I'm going to have to, you know, admit I'm a bit of a maverick on this within the community. I agree. My view is, this is my view. I'm not saying it's the right view. It's my personal view. I think we need to adopt the language of the wider education community, and I think partly because I think that's the way of demonstrating the continuum. History, like for instance, learning history doesn't start in year 1 when it's called history. It starts at it starts with very young children when they start developing a sense of time and a sense of past and present and future. You know, that is the beginnings of history, and that starts with very young children, pre nursery. Similar with science doesn't start in when you start looking at floating and sinking in year 1. It starts when you experience the natural environment, or you see natural phenomena, or you see things, you know, which again happens really early. I personally think we should call that science. I think what young children do is science. I think what they do is history. And it's an argument I lost as part of the advisory group. If they retained a sense of time and a sense of place and so on. But let's have that discussion. You know, I'm not saying I'm right. I could be wrong. I'm happy to have that discussion. But I think, but to get to the nub of that, I think language is very important. And I think how we describe, articulate, and present what we do is very important, particularly to people outside the early years sector. Which is why I think we need to use the common language. So yeah, but yes, let's have a discussion about the language. And don't know how to cut. Yeah, no, I'm going to be controversial. One of my most controversial views within the sector is about the use of the word play. Now, it's not about the concept of play. It's not about the concept of what that means. It's about the use of the word. So I'm not saying children shouldn't play. It's whether we use that to describe what happens in earlier settings, because it is a word that has a whole connotation and a whole lot of baggage and a whole lot of misinterpretation around it. This is my view, and I know it's controversial and people will be shouting at the screen now. But let me just throw this in. What if we didn't use the word play, we used something else? I don't know if I've got that far in my thinking yet. If we didn't use the word play and it changed the perception of how we worked with young children. Now, because there's a lot of emotional attachment to the word play as children's rights and so on. Actually, I think that's separate, but that's not for now. But what if just changing the word play made a difference wouldn't it be worth doing it? If it changed the way we perceive as educators, changed what we did, we used a different word, wouldn't that one thing be worth giving up for change in culture? I'm just throwing that out there, and I'm sure
Yes,
people
and
go,
you were right. You were
no.
right to describe that as a controversial thought. I entered the sector as a play worker, so I will have that
Right.
fight with you offline. We've got 3 questions. I'm keen to pose them to you, and more are coming in. There's a late flurry before we finish. So, Alex, who is a assistant head teacher, asks, "Do you have any thoughts on appropriate ways for leaders to document the tracking of individual pupil progress?"
That's a really good question. Thrown up in the air a little bit by the kind of shift both in the EYFS and by Ofsted, which certainly seem to be away from tracking and away from data. I don't think that's quite true, because I think the data is just information, and you do have to have a concept of how children develop. So whether we call it tracking, again, we're down to language, whether we call it tracking or whether we call it understanding children's development, we do need to have a sense of how they are developing and how they are accessing and progressing with the curriculum. I do think there's a backstory around this, around ticking off development matter statements and a lot of the practices that went on which were less than helpful. But I think we need to think about how we represent children's development. One of the things that I'm advocating at the moment is we look at whether or not a concept or an idea is absent, as in children don't have a concept of it or don't understand it, whether it's there if it's supported by an adult, or whether it's there when it's evident in children's self-led activity or play, if you're James. And I think that progression is actually where we can understand whether ideas, concepts and knowledge have become embedded and internalized or not. If children are using it in their everyday activity, it's secure for them. So I think we might need to look again, step back and look a little bit at how we represent progress, and particularly with development matters now being one statement. If you're using development matters, it's a question of how well embedded and secure that becomes. So I think there is a conversation about that, but I think it needs to be done without inexorably sliding back into perhaps some of the, as I say, some of the practices which existed previously.
Okay, a couple of comments agreeing to the extent of the lexicon of school subjects, science and history, etc. Julia says that she loves early years for not compartmentalising learning in the same way that school does. And Mandy Wilding, who's an education officer at NASEN, says the issue with calling it science and history is that colleagues run the risk of associating that with a more formal pedagogy and school leaders forcing more formal learning activities into early years.
No, I absolutely agree with that, but I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I think it's about understanding that science and scientific exploration or scientific hypothesis in early years is different, but it's still science. It still exists within that pedagogy and that approach. I completely take your point, though. People hear the word and associations are made, and I think we need to unpick that. And again, I think that's part of our ambassadorial advocacy in terms of early years to do that.
It's easy for us to understand those nuances. I guess the risk is that misinterpretation again, isn't it? And final word goes to Catherine Lyon. Parent partnerships need to go beyond just reporting what a child has done and hopefully learned, but engaging them in appropriate ways and needing help with behaviour. And educators are often not confident or trained in doing this proactively. Many, in her experience, are scared of parents. I don't just see them as a revenue stream. I think certainly in terms of fear of working with parents, I'd certainly like to see much more of that in college qualifications, because it's an essential, not an optional part of the job. Catherine's the Director of Quality Early Years Limited. Any response to that before we finish?
No, absolutely. I think working with parents isn't again, it's not something that just happens like everything else. I think it's a skill that needs to be developed and nurtured and informed. And again, like children, parents are unique, and parents often bring a lot with them that I think is part of the whole environment. So it needs, you're right, I think it needs a greater emphasis, and it needs to be part. It's not a question of closing the door and parents being on the other side. It needs to be part of what you're doing as an educator, an integral part, absolutely.
Okay, on that note, thanks Jan for your time. It's been a pleasure to unpick some of those things that were raised in the content of the Hey EYFS conference, and things that have happened in terms of the response to it and the content of our policy paper that we launched that day. They're all available on our website and online for you to watch the various recordings. We promise we will keep you all informed of developments at Hey and the ways in which you can get involved in the future. But we did want to finish off that piece of work with the conference by having plenty of time to talk about it, and a good dedicated hour. At Hempsall's, we're used to doing coffee break sessions. I think this perhaps is our first lunch break one. And I would venture that lots of people have been having their lunch and listening to that fantastic discussion. So thank you very much, Jan. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you again very soon. Good afternoon.